Hi, I'm Suzanne. I am a videographer and photographer, and I am here because this month is International Women's Day on the 8th of March. In keeping with this year's theme of #ChooseToChallenge, I've been working with 9 brilliant women creating a photo series to represent different stereotypes that modern Australian women face. Alongside this photo series, we've recorded a conversation on each of these topics to help create a dialogue around them for International Women's Day. You're going to get one a day until the 9th of March, so stay tuned. Today's topic is #ChooseToChallenge Victimisation, and I'm talking with Chloe. Please be aware that this video touches on some topics of abuse. We have kept it fairly surface level as to not be too intense for any listeners, but if this is a trigger for you, please consider skipping this episode and waiting for the next one. Today we're going to talk about victimised, and we went back and forth, and we've talked about this quite a lot on the use of this word, because for a long time I didn't want to, and then we realised that the fact that we were avoiding this word is part of the issue, which we will go into. But today I'm here with
Chloe. Hi.
And so tell us a little bit about you.
I work in marketing, employer marketing specifically, originally from Perth and moved to Sydney, which I now call home, about 8 years ago.
So, I mean, obviously you know why you're here, and thank you so much for being here. But just to inform all of you, the reason that we've got Chloe here is that she was actually in a 6-year-long, quite an abusive relationship, emotionally abusive, and financially, which we're not going to discuss today. And we know that obviously this is a significant issue in Australia, particularly with the domestic violence rates that we have, particularly during COVID. But what we're obviously going to focus a little bit more on is the emotional stuff. And I think that's something that people do need to hear about more, because it is harder to spot. It's less believed, and it's just something that we're not as aware of as a society, or how to tackle it. When did you first realize that the relationship you're in was abusive?
A really long way into it. And that's not to say that I didn't know that what was happening was not okay. But for me to kind of realize that it fit the bill for what is termed emotional abuse, I think took me a really long time. It started, I mean, it was over the course of 6 years. So it's not something that all comes at you all at once. It's something that kind of builds over time. Like, you know, that analogy around put a frog in warm water and it warms up and it doesn't really notice. But if you put a frog in hot water, it'll jump straight out. It's really fitting in that, like, small little things that build over time end up being a big list of really unacceptable behaviour at the end of 6 years. You don't even realise that it fits the bill of what people call emotional abuse.
And so then in that, and having been through that, what would you say, looking back now with hindsight, were the red flags that you'd wish that you'd like looked out for, you would tell other people to look out for? What would you...
It's just a giant walking red flag. I actually don't think it's very useful for someone who's in that situation to hear about what red flags are.
Okay.
The reason I think that is reflecting on my time in that relationship. I kind of knew, and someone walking up to me and saying, you know, that's a red flag, you need to run, wasn't really going to change.
Well, and from what you said before, people did.
Heaps of people did. And I could see myself. Pointing out the red flags, I think the way that helps is not so much people who are in an emotionally abusive situation. It more helps when people are coming out of it. It helps them identify with others, and help them reflect on the fact that it wasn't them, it was the other person. Kind of trust themselves that they weren't the crazy one. More so than helping people who are in it at the moment. But to answer your question, red flags, controlling what you would wear, what you would eat, when you saw your friends, just a whole nother level of interference with your everyday decision making that would be part of who you are as an individual.
Chipping away at you, I think you mentioned when they're deciding what you wear, and so that's obviously such a massive expression for so many people of who they are, what they wear. So what did that look like?
Yeah, I suppose to look at it now, there's this big long list of no leopard print, no black, only red or clear nail polish.
You had a rule book.
No.
Oh gosh.
There wasn't a
explicitly.
No, it wasn't. It was more a believing it was in my best interests to only wear certain things. If, for example, I wore black to the gym one day, it was kicked out of the car on the side of the road, left there and it was my fault because
how dare you wear black?
Right.
Which, I mean, in standing outside of it now, that seems absolutely ridiculous. And I imagine that anybody hearing this is like, well, of course this person's crazy.
Yeah.
But I guess it doesn't start there.
It doesn't start there. It starts with, oh, you look really nice when you wear that tight top. You should wear that more often. That's how it starts. And then it becomes a little bit more of trial and error of,
oh, I'm not really a fan of this.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then fast forward 5 or 6 years and I can't believe you wear that nail polish. You have no taste. This is why I don't let you make decisions about X, Y, Z. It's because you would make the wrong decision anyway. Over time, each one of those little things gets added. So by the end of 6 years, you have this big long list of things where once I had removed myself from that situation, it was almost overwhelming the level of choice that I had. Oh my God, I can wear jeans.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like I'm wearing jeans right now, but I do have pants on. But it's quite a overwhelming experience.
Yeah,
for me
so
at the
I
time.
imagine a lot of people would probably expect that you feel freed by that, but it was probably a little bit terrifying.
Yeah, I was wearing a uniform for 6 years.
Yeah.
And it was almost, this reaction of, just overwhelming feeling, I guess.
Yeah. And that's just clothing.
Yeah, that's just clothing.
And that's not even, I imagine, the worst of it.
Yeah. And I think it's almost the whole environment that you're operating in makes it so that even though you see the red flags, you think it's in your best interests to explain them away.
Yeah. In the dynamic of a male and female relationship, that you were fulfilling a role. He had this expectation as living as a person in our society of what a wife should be, and he was pushing that onto you, and you had to fulfill this role.
The part that kind of fits the piece of emotional abuse, which it really makes me cringe saying that, but it does fit the bill, is only respecting, liking, loving the parts of someone that you see as a reflection of yourself, and that
fit the narrative
that he wants, or everything else. Discard, repress, just forget about, ignore. Which then, to me, becomes I just don't become myself, and I'm like a shell of myself when there's so many other parts to me, but they're kind of discarded.
So what's going to make the biggest difference in helping us challenge this? And I mean, obviously we haven't even touched on the massive plethora of, oh my goodness, that is the physical side of this. And I know that there was a part of that became relevant in your relationship, which again, we don't need to talk about. But when we're trying to, as a society, as either somebody who's been in that place or as somebody who's trying to help someone in that place or coming out of that place, what do you think we need to be doing?
I guess what I've learned is you're a lot smarter, stronger than you think you are right now. And so if you can just look at the present, so today, what can I do? Or where am I at today? I'm always going to have situations that I need to deal with. I'm going to have to find somewhere to live. I'm going to have to face my family, whatever it is. Those situations are kind of your future problem.
Yeah. What is the next step?
What do you have right now
Yeah.
that you can do, and get through the present? Everyone else who perhaps might have friends or family in that situation, help them deal with the practical tasks is probably the easy one. But probably the biggest one is just come from a place of believing what they're saying. I think it's easy for me to see how it's the case, but I know from my experience when I shared a story or shared, experiences, a lot of the reaction I got was, really? Him? But he's not like that. Or how surely there must be like more to this story.
You're not telling me everything.
You're not telling me, or it's not helpful to put that person in a position where they're now not just being vulnerable and sharing their story with someone. They're now defending the validity of it.
Yeah.
That can come later. And I think I do say this comes from only my experience, but definitely more prevalent when the male is the person who is asserting the inappropriate behaviour on the female, is the guy mates and what they can do to completely diffuse the situation 100%. Like that. I know from my experience, my partner, obviously ex-partner, was very concerned with what others thought of him and how he was perceived. That was pretty much his biggest priority. So the idea of his mates disproving of anything to do with him.
Did they see it?
Yeah, they would see it. But not to the full extent that it happened. They would never, like, they'd see snippets.
Yeah.
And they'd see parts which anyone would recognize as
and say that
being inappropriate.
Yeah.
Whereas there was so much more that would happen that no one would recognize or no one would see. But at those points in time, it wasn't said at the time. So later on, they would say to me, we saw that, we didn't agree with it, that wasn't right.
So they support you behind closed doors.
That's it. So it, like, in some ways, I get it, and it helps them feel better.
Hard.
And I get it. And it also, like, it at least gave me peace of mind of, okay, I'm not the only one in this whole scenario. I'm not alone that saw that or thinks that could be wrong.
Give you a bit of peace of mind.
But what would be better or more beneficial, I suppose, more helpful, would be to call it out at the time.
Oh, yeah.
And to say, oh, hang on. Like, and you don't need to be like,
it doesn't need to be serious and like,
it doesn't need to be a big drama. It just needs to be, calm down, mate. That's not on.
100%.
That's all it needs to be.
Yeah, or just not cool.
Yeah. And especially for someone who cares so much about what other people think of them, that's all it would take for them to be like, oh, wait, oh, maybe not.
Yeah.
And I mean, one instance like that is not going to, change everything.
But if societally that's normalized, that makes a big difference. And like you said, obviously it's hard because confrontation for a lot of people is hard. But I guess the perspective is, if you want to live in a world where this kind of thing isn't happening or isn't happening as often, because it's happening a lot, is saying, well, yeah, I might be uncomfortable for the 2 minutes that I have this conversation, and 2 minutes would be very long. It's probably not going to take that long. Is nowhere near as uncomfortable as her life must be if this happens all the time. And granted, we don't want to assume that every relationship where we see something that we're a bit like, oh, is a bad relationship. But if you're calling it out when you see it, then you're committing to this part of society that stops or it says it's not acceptable to have that kind of behaviour.
Yeah.
You know, the standard by which you pass is the standard you accept.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say as well is, so I'll put it in my scenario. Someone could come up to me and say, hey, I saw what happened last week and I just want to let you know I don't agree with it. There could be parts of me that wants to cover it up and say, oh yeah, no, but I did do this before, or he's just having a bad day, or yeah, but you know, making excuses. And the reason for that is you end up protecting the reputation of your relationship, which also, side note, makes it harder for people to believe you when you do tell them the extent of it.
Yeah, because you covered it up.
Yeah, because you're like, oh no, I saw you that day and you were fine. And you're like, well, yeah.
I was pretending.
Yeah. You don't want your friends to worry, and you don't want them, you kind of like, I got it, it's cool, like, you know, I can handle it kind of thing. Or, you know, don't worry kind of situation.
Yeah. Or even just like a part of why we didn't want to call this victimized is that there is this association with, oh, but if you think that I'm a victim here, if we start using that word with me, that's shameful on me.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads me into the next question as well, is that what kind of, when you do, people learn this about you or you're talking about it, what kind of assumptions do people make? Because I imagine, again, this is part of this series, this is something that when you are victimized, you go into a pigeonhole and you can only be what kinds of things have you heard?
I've heard like, but I thought you were so smart.
Yes.
Like how could I think you were so smart and this happened to you?
Yeah.
Like, how could you have put up with it for so long? I thought you were the kind of person that would, you know, be defiant or, you know.
So you weren't strong enough either.
Well, yeah, or, not strong enough, or just kind of complacent in the situation.
Yeah. So it's your fault somehow.
Well,
I don't think people are saying that to you,
but that's the impression that you get. Or I don't blame them for thinking that, right?
I don't think that they do even think it's your fault, but it's kind of this, you know, still the victim blaming. Again, another issue in society. It's this, without us having consciously think about it, the first thing we go to is, well, how could you have stopped it, particularly with women?
Yeah.
What could you have done, rather than how do we fix the issue? It's how do we fix the person who's having to deal with the issue, which makes no sense.
I think it's more, I agree to some extent, but I also think it's more like the red flags were so obvious. How could you, for 6 years?
Yeah.
I guess in that sense it would be come from a place of non-judgment and it's really hard. Like I struggle with it myself of like, you stayed for that long after all this stuff, after he even just did that one thing, you went back. And
there is
that's
emotion
not
involved.
helpful. Yeah, it needs to come from a place of cool, that happened.
Oh yeah. What's
now
next? What do you need?
Now what?
Yeah.
What do you need?
Yeah.
How can I? Yeah, it's.
Yeah, don't beat them up for a mistake that wasn't theirs.
Yeah, and it can't. It needs to come. You know, we were saying before, it needs to come from a place of believing, so that if someone, it would have taken a lot for someone to admit. The extent of the situation they were in.
Yeah.
And I think that needs to be acknowledged by whoever they're being that vulnerable with. It needs to come from a place, whoa, that must have taken, and hold back okay, I'm just going to, really? Is that really what happened? You know, there must be two sides to the story, that kind of thing. Conversation can come later if it needs to. But when someone is being that vulnerable with you, it needs to be in a place of, I believe you. Now what do we do about it?
Yeah.
Is the most helpful thing I think other people can do to help that person.
Women.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's easier said than done because it's new information to the person who's hearing it, but it's not new information to the person who's saying it. And for someone who, you know, fits another picture of, you know, has a career, has an education, is like generally a smart, well-functioning person, and is generally positive, optimistic, like all of these things, it just doesn't compute. It doesn't match the idea of
a victim.
A victim.
Yeah. And I guess it probably does not help that women are encouraged to be humble. And I mean that in the true sense of the word humble, which is almost self-deprecating. From
my experience, you get in relationships what you believe you deserve. And also, and it's like, it's something that I've heard other people say around what you accept will continue. But if what you accept is what you think you deserve,
then it just keeps
going.
And
that's
only
how
takes,
you end up 6 years later.
Yeah. And it only takes somebody who takes advantage of that situation and keeps pushing the limits.
That's it.
To become quite an abusive situation.
And don't get me wrong, at the beginning, it was chalk and cheese, the beginning to the end.
Yeah.
Because I agree, anyone in their right mind would not just walk into a situation like that and stay there for 6 years.
Yeah.
It's something that builds, which is part of the challenge, I think, for outsiders to recognize and call out as well. Part of my biggest challenge was humiliation and I did feel like a failure. I knew I wasn't. But it was the humiliation part of, you know, you build it up and you're like, everything's going to be fine. Everything's fine. Everything's fine, guys. And then it really, I knew it wasn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. I knew walking down the aisle it wasn't.
I imagine that's probably a large part of any kind of abusive relationship, that it's, a huge amount of energy goes into, it's fine. So that almost becomes one of the largest barriers in getting out of it.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to your point around I would never, I still won't call myself a victim, but if you, outside of the word victim, the meaning of it, or
the definition
of it, I think is something which I know I didn't want people thinking that of me.
Yeah.
So it was almost a cover up. I didn't want people saying like,
oh, poor Chloe.
Yeah, or like, also I didn't want people thinking like you're not a feminist, which that kind of thing, where like I am.
Yeah.
But it's like
it's a failure.
How could you possibly say you're a feminist when you put up with this behavior or this kind of, how could you say that about yourself?
Some incredible, intelligent, brilliant, wonderful women can be victimized.
Well, and also I kind of see it now that I have perspective. I see me walking away and having this conversation with you now as an act of feminism.
Oh, that's massive.
Think it's almost I was contradicting a lot of my own beliefs of what is right and wrong in any male-female relationship, whether it be romantic or not. In my own relationship, I was completely contradicting myself, being like, you shouldn't put up with that, but I will.
Yes, yeah.
A huge part was building the trust back in yourself, like your ability to read a situation, just to trust yourself, and that kind of level of self-worth that comes with that. But then the other piece is forgiving yourself as well for going against what you knew to be true.
So then, as a wider issue, what we want to be looking at is checking in with our friends always, regardless of the topic, but particularly here, and don't pass by inappropriate behavior, especially if they're your friends. Especially if they're your friends, because you can have a respectful, kind conversation where you're telling them that behavior is not okay. And I think also part of, in your specific case, what was the issue is still the value that is placed on the male gaze, and I think the objectification of women.
a lot of the behaviour he displayed is on him, and he is an extreme exception to the rule. I don't think he represents typical male behaviour at all. But the reactions or the
society
lack
he
of
lives in
action
supports
from
it.
other people, I think definitely has a way to go.
Yeah.
And one of my very best girlfriends says, like, values are only values when they're tested. And I think it's easy for other women, for men to say that I don't accept that behaviour, I would never accept that behaviour, but then when it happens, they're complicit.
Letting it pass, yeah.
It takes a bit more guts, I guess, to in the moment go, actually, no, I value, you know, XYZ, and I'm standing up for that value here, regardless of what that makes me look like in this scenario.
Even if it's not in as many words.
Yeah.
So then what do you think is the biggest thing that you've taken out of this? Because obviously this is not the summary of you.
What I've taken away from it is it's not the be all and end all of your whole life. It doesn't need to be.
Doesn't define you.
Doesn't define. It's necessary to make you who you are later. I wouldn't be who I am now without it, and I wouldn't be who I will be, you know, hopefully when I turn 70 or 80, without having that experience. But it's not the whole story. No. It's just a chapter of it.
Tying back into something that you said earlier about making sure that you're understanding the importance of the people sharing their stories with you. Thank you for sharing your story with me.
Pleasure.
And I know that we didn't go into everything, but I really appreciate your take on this all and your experience. And I'm so happy that you're out of that relationship now and that you're on to bigger and better things, and your new guy sounds wonderful. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.